He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw a single punch. He just stood up, while every other person in that cafe looked away. A frightened woman, a powerful man with his hand around her wrist, and one former Navy SEAL who decided without hesitation that this was the moment. Nobody knew his name. Nobody knew what he'd survived. Nobody knew that the woman he saved was worth $3 billion, or that protecting her for 30 seconds was about to cost him everything he'd spent 4 years rebuilding. This is the story of Ethan Cross, a mechanic, a father, a man who learned the hardest way that love isn't the absence of fear. It's moving anyway. If this story hooks you in the first minute, subscribe now and hit the bell, because I've got stories coming that will stop you cold. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The wrench slipped. It wasn't the first time that morning, and Ethan Cross knew it wouldn't be the last. His knuckles scraped the rusted underside of a '09 Ford F-150, and he hissed through his teeth, pulling his hand back and staring at the blood blooming across two knuckles like he was mildly curious about someone else's injury. He reached for the shop rag hanging off his belt loop, wiped it clean, and went right back to work. That was the thing about Ethan Cross. He didn't linger. Not on small pain, not on big pain. You bled, you wiped it, you kept moving. It was the only operating principle he'd kept from his 12 years in the Navy. The rest of it, the medals, the citations, the brotherhood, all of that was packed in a cardboard box on the top shelf of his bedroom closet, under a winter jacket he hadn't worn since Montana. He worked alone in the garage. No radio today. He turned it off after the morning news ran a piece about a father in Phoenix who'd lost custody of his kids, and he'd found himself gripping the torque wrench too hard, standing very still, listening to something that felt like his own heartbeat echoing in an empty room. He turned the radio off. He worked. At 7:48 a.m., the side door banged open and Sophie Cross appeared in the frame, wearing her school backpack, her hair half braided, one shoe untied, eating a granola bar like it owed her something. "Dad," she announced, "we're going to be late." "You said that yesterday." "We were late yesterday." "We were 40 seconds late." "Mrs. Keller gave me a look, Dad, a specific look." Ethan rolled out from under the truck, sat up on the creeper, and looked at his daughter. She was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of dark brown that was almost amber in morning light, and she was staring at him with her arms crossed and one hip cocked, like she was 45 and managing a board meeting. He felt it, the way he always felt it, that specific tightness in the center of his chest. Not grief, exactly. Something more complicated than grief. "Give me 2 minutes," he said. "You look like a raccoon," she told him, gesturing at his face. He reached up and touched his jaw, felt the grease. "It's character. It's grease. Same thing." She rolled her eyes with the commitment of an Olympic athlete. 2 minutes, Dad. I'm timing you." They made it in time. Not with margin, but in time. Which was the best Ethan Cross had managed since the autumn Claire died, when he'd spent 3 weeks straight not entirely sure what day it was. A grief counselor he'd seen exactly twice told him structure was everything. "Give yourself anchors," she'd said. Morning routine, meals, school drop-off. He'd decided she was right mostly by accident. The routine hadn't saved him from grief. It had just given him enough forward momentum to pass through it without stopping long enough to drown. He dropped Sophie at the front entrance of Millbrook Elementary, watched her run up the steps without looking back. She never looked back. She was that kind of kid. And then sat in his truck for a moment in the drop-off lane while other parents honked gently behind him. He put it in drive. The cafe was called Archer's. It had been called something else when he first moved to Millbrook, but the previous owner had sold it to a woman named Donna, who put a chalkboard outside advertising serious coffee, casual attitude, and had somehow made it the center of gravity for the entire downtown. Ethan went there because the coffee was strong, and Donna didn't ask too many questions. He took his usual stool at the counter, second from the left, back to the wall, clear sight lines to the door and both windows. Old habit. Not one he was going to break. Donna slid a black coffee in front of him before he sat down. "You've got grease on your face," she said. "My daughter mentioned something about that." Smart kid. Terrifyingly so. He opened the Millbrook Gazette, an actual paper, 8 pages, mostly local school board drama, and a column by a retired judge named Harold, who apparently had opinions about everything. And he drank his coffee, and he let the morning exist around him without demanding anything from it. It was a Tuesday in September. The cafe was maybe 60% full. He knew most of the faces. That was something about Millbrook. 4 years in, and he knew the faces, knew the orders, knew who'd had a bad week, and who was celebrating something small. He'd chosen it for exactly that quality. Not a city, not a base, not a place that moved at the speed of threat assessment, just a town, a place where Sophie could have a childhood that felt like a childhood. He was on his second cup when the door opened. He noticed her the way he noticed most things, without appearing to notice at all. She came in fast, head slightly lowered, shoulder bag pulled close to her body. Late 20s or early 30s. Dark blazer over a silk blouse that didn't belong in Millbrook. Jeans that probably cost more than his monthly truck payment. She moved like someone used to rooms with better carpets, but she was scanning. Exits, faces, corners. And that scan was not the casual glance of a person looking for a table. That was the glance of someone running a check. Or being followed. She took a corner booth, asked for coffee when Donna's waitress came over, barely looked up. Ethan went back to Harold's column on town parking regulations. He'd learned early on in his first deployment, a VBSS op off the coast of Djibouti, tanker seizure, 6-man team, 4 hostiles, that the most dangerous thing you could do was let your pattern recognition outrun your context. Not everything is a threat. Not everyone moving fast is a target. His platoon commander used to say that. Chief Petty Officer Ray Drummond, a man who ate red licorice constantly and had somehow never lost a man. Assess first. Act when necessary. Don't create a problem that isn't there. So Ethan assessed. She was nervous. She was hiding from something. She was drinking her coffee with both hands wrapped around the cup like she was cold, which she wasn't. September in Millbrook was still warm enough for short sleeves. Not his problem. He went back to Harold. The door opened again 6 minutes later. And this time, Ethan's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. The man who walked in was probably 50, maybe 52. Gray at the temples, expensive charcoal suit, the particular posture of someone who had never in their adult life been told no and expected that streak to continue indefinitely. He came through the door with 2 men behind him. Not quite security, dressed too casual for that, but positioned like it. One covering the left side, one on the right, practiced without being obvious about it. Amateur hour. But real enough. Ethan set his cup down quietly. The man in the suit spotted the woman in the corner booth instantly, which meant he'd known she was here before he walked in, which meant this wasn't a coincidence, which meant someone was watching her. He crossed the cafe without pausing, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down like he owned the table and everything around it. The 2 men stayed near the door. Ethan watched. Through the cafe's ambient noise, the espresso machine, a toddler laughing 3 tables over, the scrape of chair legs, he couldn't catch words. But he didn't need words. He'd spent 4 years reading rooms in languages he didn't speak. Body language was universal. The man's jaw was tight. The woman's shoulders came up 3 inches in the first 10 seconds of the conversation. She shook her head at something he said. He leaned forward. She leaned back. He reached across the table and, not grabbing, not yet, but the gesture was clearly a warning, a border being crossed, and placed his hand over hers in a way that was supposed to look intimate to anyone watching and was clearly pressure. She pulled her hand away. He caught her wrist. Not hard. Controlled. Deliberate. "This is what I can do," the grip said, in public. "Now imagine what I can do elsewhere." Ethan was already off his stool. He didn't rush. He didn't announce himself. He moved through the cafe at normal pace, collected his coffee cup from the counter without breaking stride, something to hold, something to occupy the hands of anyone watching, and came to stop beside the booth like he'd simply walked up to say hello to someone he knew. The man in the suit looked up. Ethan didn't look at him. He looked at the woman. "Hey," he said. Easy, casual, like this was an old conversation resuming. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic on Miller was a nightmare." He glanced at the man across from her, then back to her. "Did you want me to grab a chair, or—" She was good. Whatever she was running from, she'd been running for a while because she only hesitated a fraction of a second before her face shifted. Surprise becoming recognition. Relief she was intelligent enough not to show too obviously. No, actually, she started. She's busy, the man said. Ethan looked at him for the first time. Just looked. Took maybe 2 seconds. He cataloged what he saw the way he'd been trained to catalog. Dominant hand, right. Posture, tense across the shoulders, jaw clenching. The two men by the door had noticed him but hadn't moved. They were waiting for a signal. I can see that, Ethan said. But I'm not talking to you. A silence fell in a 2-table radius around them. Donna, behind the counter, went very still. The man in the suit leaned back slightly, reassessing. He had the look of someone who used lawyers and money the way other men used their fists, as the first resort, not the last. And he was deciding which tool to reach for. You have no idea, the man said softly, who you're interrupting. No, Ethan agreed pleasantly. I don't. He set his coffee cup on the table, straightened, and in a motion so unhurried it almost looked unintentional. Almost. He positioned himself at the corner of the booth in a way that put his body between the woman and the man's grip on her wrist. And he put one hand flat on the table and just waited. Not threatening, not aggressive, just present in a way that made the air in the immediate vicinity feel different. The man felt it. Both the men by the door felt it. The woman with her wrist still caught in the man's hand felt it. And Ethan watched the moment she understood that whoever this stranger in the grease-stained work shirt was, he was not going to be moved. The man released her wrist. It wasn't surrender, not exactly. It was a tactical withdrawal. Not here, not this. And Ethan recognized it for what it was. The problem wasn't gone. The problem was postponed. We'll continue this conversation later, the man told her. She said nothing. He stood, straightened his jacket, and looked at Ethan with an expression that was flat and certain and would have frightened a different kind of man. You made a mistake, he said. Okay, Ethan said. He watched the man leave, watched both men by the door follow, watched the door fall shut. Then he exhaled through his nose, picked up his coffee cup, and looked at the woman. She was staring at him. You're not going to ask me how I'm doing? She said. Are you okay? She glanced at her wrist. There was redness there, the white pressure marks already fading. I've been worse. You want me to sit or go back to the counter? She looked at him for a long beat, something moving behind her eyes that he couldn't read. Sit, she said. He sat. Donna appeared within 30 seconds with a fresh cup of coffee for him and a practiced expression of absolute non-curiosity, which in Millbrook was a form of deep community kindness. Thank you, the woman said to Ethan once Donna left. Her voice was composed. Careful. She was arranging herself back into control like pulling a jacket closed. You don't need to. I want to. She paused. Most people looked away. I noticed. Why didn't you? He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, rather than reaching for the easy answer, because he'd been in enough debrief rooms to know that the easy answer was usually incomplete. Because I could do something about it, he said. That's pretty much the whole reason. She studied him. That's it? No speech about right and wrong? No, I don't usually have a speech ready. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. What's your name? She asked. Ethan Cross. Victoria, she said, and nothing else. He waited. She didn't offer a last name. Do you need help? He asked. Not right now. I mean beyond right now. She looked at him carefully, like she was calculating risk the way he'd calculated other kinds of risk. What does this cost? What does this expose? What's the likely play here? Why? Because whoever that man is, he knew where you were sitting before he walked in. That's not an argument. That's surveillance. Her composure cracked, barely, a millimeter, and then reset. You noticed that. It wasn't subtle. She looked down at her coffee. I'm handling it. Okay. You're not going to argue? It's your life. She looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes that was almost disconcertingly naked. The expression of someone who had been argued with and managed and maneuvered by people for so long that it's your life landed like something she hadn't heard in years. What do you do? She asked. Ethan Cross. Mechanic. I've got a shop on Harwell Road. And before that? He picked up his coffee. Navy. How long? 12 years. She nodded slowly, like something was clicking into place. That explains the... She made a gesture that seemed to indicate his general presence in space. The what? Nothing, she said. And this time it was unmistakably a smile, small and sideways and real. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. This woman with her careful eyes and her no last name and whoever the hell that man was, knowing where she was sitting before he walked in. And he thought, this is not the last time you're going to see this woman, Ethan. I don't know how I know that, but I know that. He thought about Sophie, who would be in second period by now, probably correcting her teacher's spelling on the whiteboard. He thought about how Claire would have laughed at this entire scene. He put his cup down. There's a school thing tonight, he said. My daughter's class. Science fair setup. I have to go to that. Victoria blinked. Okay. I'm saying I have to leave in about 20 minutes, but if you need somewhere to be that isn't here for a while. He slid a business card across the table. Cross Automotive, Harwell Road. His number on the back. The shop's usually open until 6. Nobody bothers anybody there. She looked at the card for a long moment without touching it. You're a strange man, Ethan Cross, she said. My daughter says something similar. She picked up the card. He thought about it on the drive back to the shop. Not in the anxious way. Not spinning it. Not projecting. Not running threat assessment the way he'd done in the years right after Claire, when every new person felt like either a risk or a reminder. Just turning it over the way you turn over a problem that is genuinely interesting before you decide whether it's actually a problem or just a thing that happened. A woman named Victoria, with no last name. A man who grabbed wrists in public because he was confident enough in his power that a witness didn't concern him. 2 men who covered exits without being told to. That's money, Ethan thought. That's real money, or real power, or both. He'd seen that specific kind of confidence in 2 places in his life. Flag officers and people who own things that flags got planted on. He pulled into the shop, killed the engine, sat for a moment. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophie's school. Reminder. Science fair table setup begins at 6 p.m. Refreshments provided. He looked at the text. He thought about the redness on Victoria's wrist, fading already, and the way she'd said I've been worse, like she'd said it before, and it was just true. He thought about 12 years of running toward things other people ran away from, and how he'd tried, genuinely, seriously tried, to leave that version of himself in a box on the top shelf of the closet with the medals. This is not your mission, he told himself. This is a woman you met for 25 minutes at Archer's Café. You gave her your card. That's it. The rest is her call. He got out of the truck. He went back to work. At 4:17 p.m., a car he didn't recognize pulled up in front of the shop. He was under the F-150 again, the same truck, the same reluctant oil pan, when he heard the tires. He rolled out on the creeper, looked at the car, a rental, from the sticker on the bumper, and watched the door open. Victoria. She'd changed clothes, still too expensive for Millbrook, but less corporate. She was carrying 2 coffees and a paper carrier from a place across town, and she stopped on the threshold of the garage bay and looked around at the space like she was mapping it. Which she was, Ethan thought, which meant she had the same instinct he had, which was interesting. She held up one of the coffees. I asked Donna what you take, she said. She said black. She's right. I also asked if you were trustworthy. She crossed the garage, offered him the cup. She said, and I'm quoting, dullest gossip in the county, which means he's probably the most reliable person in it. Ethan took the coffee. Donna should write greeting cards. Victoria looked around the shop again, then at him. I hope this isn't weird, she said. You didn't have anywhere to go. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at him like he'd said something that required reprocessing. I didn't have anywhere to go, she said quietly. Yeah. He leaned against the truck, drank his coffee. She stood in his garage in clothes that cost more than his equipment, holding her own coffee, and the afternoon light came through the big bay doors at the angle it always did in September, falling in long, flat bars across the concrete, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. It wasn't uncomfortable. That was the strange part. It was not uncomfortable. His phone buzzed. Dad, what's for dinner? See? He showed it to Victoria without thinking, and she read it, and the expression that crossed her face was small and brief, and he almost missed it. Something old in it, something that had been hungry for a long time. Sophie, she said. That's your daughter? Yeah. She texts like an adult. She thinks she is one. The ghost of the almost smile again. What's for dinner? Victoria asked. Pasta, probably, or cereal. Depends on how the afternoon goes. She looked at him. I make a good pasta, she said. If that's not... I'm not trying to... Do you want to come for dinner? She stopped. Yes, she said, before she'd clearly decided to. He nodded, went back to the truck, got back on the creeper. You're just going to go back to work? She said. Truck won't fix itself. There was a pause. Then the sound of her pulling over the old step stool he kept by the workbench and sitting down and drinking her coffee. He worked. She stayed. It was the most ordinary hour Ethan Cross had experienced in 4 years. Sophie Cross came home at 4:55 with a backpack that somehow weighed more than she did, a retelling of a conflict with a boy named Marcus that involved some debate about whether dinosaurs could have survived with better immune systems, and the immediate absolute detection of a stranger in her house. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. Victoria was at the stove. She'd found the pasta. She'd found the sauce. She was managing both with the quiet competence of someone who'd either been trained or self-taught. Ethan guessed self-taught, from the way she held the wooden spoon slightly wrong but got the results right anyway. Sophie looked at her father. Ethan looked at Sophie. Sophie, he said, this is Victoria. She's a friend. Sophie looked at Victoria with the particular 8-year-old intensity that adults always underestimated. Victoria looked back, also with intensity, not backing down. Hi, Sophie said. Hi, Victoria said. Do you know what you're doing? Sophie asked, nodding at the stove. Approximately. Sophie considered this, dropped her backpack, climbed up onto the kitchen counter, something Ethan had been specifically not quite successfully prohibiting for 2 years, and watched. You're overcooking the garlic, she said. Victoria looked at the pan. You're right. She adjusted. Sophie watched her do it. Okay, Sophie said after a moment, like something had been decided. Dinner was good. That was the simple truth of it. The pasta was good. The conversation was the ordinary chaotic tangle of a meal with a child who had many opinions. The kitchen was warm. The light above the table was the slightly too yellow color of a bulb that needed replacing. And Victoria laughed twice, real laughs, unguarded, the kind you couldn't arrange, at things Sophie said. Ethan watched her laugh. He watched her in the way he watched things he didn't yet understand, carefully and from a slight distance, and with something that had been quiet in him for a long time shifting in its sleep. After dinner, Sophie went to do homework, and Victoria helped him with the dishes, and they stood at the sink together without much conversation, and it was fine. It was exactly fine. Thank you, she said. For what? For... She glanced around. At the kitchen, the drawings on the refrigerator, the homework spread across the counter, the life evident in every direction. For this. You cooked. You invited me. He handed her a pot to dry. She took it. Outside, the first stars were visible through the kitchen window, and Millbrook was making its evening sounds. A dog, someone's television, the distant clean ring of a bike bell on the path by the river. Who was he? Ethan asked quietly. This morning. A pause. Someone I used to know, she said. Is he dangerous? She was quiet for a long moment. He thinks he isn't. That's what makes him dangerous. Ethan nodded, let it sit, didn't push. She dried the pot, put it on the wrong shelf, and he didn't correct her. I should go, she said. Okay. She got her bag, stopped at the front door. Sophie's great, she said. Not like a compliment, like a statement of something that had moved her. I know, he said. She opened the door. The night air came in. Ethan Cross, she said. Victoria. She looked at him with that specific look again, the one he couldn't fully decode, and then she walked out, and he stood in the doorway and watched the rental car pull away from the curb and disappear at the end of the block. He stood there a moment. Somewhere above him, Sophie yelled, "Dad, do we have a calculator?" He closed the door. He went upstairs. He found the calculator. 3 days later, Ethan was reading the Gazette when his phone buzzed with a news alert. Not local, national. He almost swiped it away. Hale Industries heiress. Victoria Hale missing. Board calls emergency meeting as controlling interest remains in absent heir's hands. The article had a photo. Victoria. Different context. She was stepping out of a car at some event, hair up, jewelry he'd never seen, the particular posture of someone who had been photographed her entire life and no longer registered cameras, but unmistakably, completely, without any question at all. Victoria. Ethan stared at the photo for a long time. Then he set the phone face down on the counter and picked up his coffee. He sat with it. The daughter of Gerald Hale, founder of Hale Industries. Heir to a controlling stake in a company with a market cap in the tens of billions. Subject of a boardroom coup currently unfolding in the New York financial press. A woman with a name that appeared in headlines and on corporate filings and, apparently, on SEC reports for 3 different holding companies. A woman who had come to his garage yesterday afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and sat on his step stool for an hour, saying almost nothing, while he changed an oil pan. A woman who made pasta slightly wrong and laughed at Sophie's dinosaur arguments and quietly dried dishes in his kitchen and said thank you, like she was saying something she didn't get to say very often. He picked up his phone. He put it back down. He picked it up again and found her number. She'd programmed it in herself before she left the first evening, taking his phone with a confidence he'd found oddly reassuring. And he typed, "Saw the news. You okay?" He stared at it. He deleted it. He sat for another moment. Then he typed, "Still got coffee if you need somewhere to be." He sent it before he reconsidered. 30 seconds later, 3 dots appeared. Then, "Give me an hour." And underneath that, 10 seconds later, a second message that arrived like something said quickly before she could stop herself. "I was going to tell you." Ethan looked at those 4 words for a long time. Then his eyes moved to the window, to the September morning outside, to the quiet residential block, and the oak tree at the edge of the yard with the tire swing Sophie refused to use, but refused to let him take down either. He put the phone in his pocket. He went to start the coffee. 3 weeks later, a black town car with New York plates stopped at the end of Harwell Road, and a man in a charcoal suit, not the same man from the café, a different one, younger, with the same eyes, photographed the sign above Ethan's garage for 45 seconds, then got back in the car and drove away. Ethan didn't see it, but the man who sent the car noted the address in a leather-bound notebook, drew a single line beneath it, and picked up his phone. "Found her," he said. She told him on a Wednesday. Not because she'd planned to. Victoria Hale had not, in fact, planned a single thing that had happened in the last 3 weeks with any degree of accuracy, but because Sophie had found a magazine. It was a back issue of Financial Quarterly, dog-eared and half-buried under a stack of Popular Mechanics on the workbench, and Sophie had pulled it out with the indiscriminate curiosity of a child who read everything. And on the cover was a photograph of Victoria in a conference room in Midtown Manhattan, dark blazer, hair pulled back, looking at the camera with an expression that the article inside described as ruthless focus, but which Victoria remembered as "I haven't slept in 31 hours, and this photographer will not stop talking." Sophie had stared at the cover. Then she'd held it up in Ethan's direction. "Dad," she said, "this is Victoria." Ethan had been under the hood of a Subaru Outback and had not immediately emerged. "Dad, I heard you. It says she's a billionaire." A pause from under the hood. "I know," he said. Sophie looked at the magazine, looked at the garage doorway where Victoria's rental car was parked outside, looked at the magazine again. "Does she know you know?" "Yeah." "Does she know that you know and you didn't make it weird?" Ethan finally came up from under the hood, reached for the shop rag. We talked about it. Sophie put the magazine down, looked at her father with the particular expression she used when she was assembling information into a conclusion she hadn't fully committed to yet. Okay, she said, eventually. That was it. That was Sophie's entire processing of the situation. One okay, and then she went back to her homework on the step stool, and when Victoria arrived 40 minutes later with coffee and a question about whether they wanted Thai food tonight because she'd passed a place on Route 9 that smelled genuinely promising, Sophie looked up from her textbook and said, "Yes, but Dad always gets too much and then feels guilty about the leftovers." And that was the last time anyone in the Cross household treated Victoria Hale's financial profile as a topic of active conversation. Ethan had watched the whole exchange and thought, not for the first time, that his daughter might be the most emotionally intelligent person he knew. The Thai food was good. The leftovers were indeed too much, and Ethan did feel guilty about them, and Victoria looked at him from across the table with an expression that was somewhere between fond and delighted, and Sophie said, "I told you." And somehow, that was the evening that something shifted between all three of them. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just the quiet click of a door opening that nobody had been pushing on. The billionaire stayed for 3 hours. She was back the next afternoon, and the one after that. It happened gradually, and then all at once, the way most things do. Victoria had taken a room at the only hotel in Millbrook worth the name. The Harwell Inn, 12 rooms, a breakfast that arrived in a basket, owned by a couple named Frank and Arlene, who were deeply incurious about their guests in a way that Millbrook seemed to systematically produce. She told the board she needed time. She told her lawyers she was managing a personal matter. She told no one where she was, and for reasons she didn't fully examine, she stayed. She told herself it was practical. She needed distance from New York, from the board, from Marcus Vane, the man from the café, whose full name she'd been careful not to give Ethan, and whose patience she knew had limits. She told herself that Millbrook was a good place to think, that the quiet was useful. She did not tell herself the truth, which was simpler. She didn't want to leave. She started showing up at the garage not just in the afternoons, but in the mornings too. Sometimes before Ethan had unlocked the bay doors, sitting on the hood of her rental car with 2 coffees and her laptop, taking calls she spoke quietly into and closed the moment he appeared. He never asked about the calls. She never explained them. There was an agreement between them, unspoken and mutual, that her other life was a weather system they were both aware of, and neither was ready to stand in yet. She learned his rhythms, that he worked best in silence until noon, then needed the radio, country, which surprised her because he seemed like a classic rock person. And he said, "I grew up in Tennessee, not a Springsteen record," with enough dryness that she laughed out loud before she could stop herself. That he ate lunch at his workbench unless Sophie was home from school, in which case lunch was the event with opinions about sandwiches. That he slept badly sometimes, she could tell from the particular flatness around his eyes on certain mornings. And on those mornings, he needed the first coffee to sit in his hand for a full 5 minutes before he said anything, and she learned to let it. She learned that he never talked about the Navy unless she asked specific questions, and when she did, his answers were short and factual. 12 years, special operations, 2 tours in the Gulf, 1 in the Pacific, mustered out when Sophie needed a parent on the ground and Claire got sick. And the last part he said the same way every time, without looking away, just saying it clean the way you said a thing you decided not to be destroyed by. She didn't ask about Claire more than once. She learned that he built things in the evenings, not cars. He repaired cars at work, and when he came home he built other things. Shelves, mostly. A new step for the back porch. A small box with a dovetail joint for Sophie's art supplies that he'd spent 2 weeks on and refused to acknowledge was elaborate. "That's a complicated box," she said the night he finished it. "It's just a box." "That joint took you 11 attempts. I counted the sandpaper pile." He looked at her sideways. "You counted the sandpaper pile." "I was curious." "About sandpaper." About why a man who can disassemble a carburetor in the dark spends 11 tries on a corner joint. He picked up the box, looked at it, set it down. Claire used to say I had a problem with good enough, he said, that I didn't trust it. Victoria looked at the box. The joint was in fact perfect, clean and tight and square in a way that didn't require being looked at closely to appreciate. She wasn't wrong, Victoria said. He picked up his tools. No, he said, she wasn't. They sat with that for a moment. The comfortable weight of it, without pressure, without anyone needing to fill the space. And Victoria thought about how rare that was. How many rooms she'd sat in, how many dinners and meetings and social events she'd navigated in the last 10 years of her adult life, and how almost none of them had felt like this. Like the air itself was not demanding anything from her. She was aware that this was dangerous. She was aware that she was getting used to this, which was different from it being hers, which was the thing she kept not letting herself think about directly. Sophie Cross, for her part, conducted the whole situation with the precision of a small general. She did not mother the arrangement or sentimentalize it. She was 8, not 5. And she had the Cross family's constitutional resistance to obvious emotion. But she absorbed Victoria into the household's daily mechanics with a thoroughness that was, in its way, louder than anything she might have said. She started saving Victoria a seat at breakfast on the mornings Victoria came early. Not formally, she'd just put a cup on the table on the Victoria side, and if Victoria wasn't there yet, the cup stayed there until she arrived. She showed Victoria her science project, which was about water filtration, not because she needed help with it, but because she wanted a specific opinion and had decided Victoria was a person worth consulting. She asked for help with a math problem once, and when Victoria showed her 2 methods and let her pick, Sophie looked at her with something serious and evaluating in her expression, and then said simply, "You're good at explaining things," and went back to her homework. Coming from Sophie Cross, that was a significant statement. Ethan watched his daughter do all of this, and he felt something he didn't have the right word for. It was close to gratitude, but it was also close to fear, and those 2 things were tangled together in a way he didn't try too hard to separate, because he knew what Sophie was doing. He knew what it meant, that a child who had not warmed easily to anyone since her mother died, who had been polite and self-sufficient and quietly, carefully guarded, was putting out cups and asking for opinions and saying you're good at explaining things in the voice she used when she meant something. He knew what that cost Sophie, the risk of it. And he knew that the person Sophie was risking it on had a life in New York City that involved boardrooms and SEC filings, and a man named Marcus Vane who knew how to surveil and threaten in public with complete confidence in his own impunity. He sat with that knowledge the way he sat with most difficult things, quietly and in private, turning it over without resolving it, because some problems didn't resolve. They just became ones you were still holding when something else happened. Victoria had been in Millbrook 5 weeks when Sophie's school held the fall parent event, an evening of student presentations in the gymnasium, 3rd grade through 5th, an annual thing that Millbrook Elementary took seriously enough to set up a PA system and have someone's father in charge of the projector. Ethan had told Victoria about it without exactly inviting her, in the way he sometimes communicated things, stating the fact and leaving the door open without making the opening explicit. "Sophie's doing her water filtration thing Thursday," he said. "The school thing." "What time?" 6. "Okay." She came. She sat beside Ethan in the 3rd row of folding chairs, and Sophie found them when she was done setting up her project table. And the look on Sophie's face when she spotted Victoria, the brief, controlled flash of something bright that she immediately recomposed into her standard expression of studied cool, that look was the thing that Ethan kept coming back to later. Sophie presented her project with the seriousness of a person defending a dissertation. She had charts. She had a demonstration with actual dirty water and a filter she'd built from a 2-liter bottle, sand, gravel, and charcoal. She explained the chemistry in terms she'd clearly worked out carefully, so they were accurate but accessible. She was 8 years old, and she was, objectively, the best presenter in the room. Victoria watched the whole thing without a word, and at the end she clapped in a way that was not performative, just direct, clean applause, which was somehow more meaningful than enthusiasm. On the way out, Sophie walked between them across the parking lot, and without discussion or arrangement she took Victoria's hand as well as Ethan's, the way children do when they've decided that's how it is. And Victoria looked down at Sophie's hand in hers and then straight ahead at the parking lot. And Ethan, who was on Sophie's other side and couldn't see Victoria's face clearly, could see enough. He looked away. He looked at the October sky above the school, and he thought about 12 years of operating in places where the one rule was don't get attached to outcomes you can't control. And he thought about how completely useless that rule was in a parking lot in Millbrook, New Jersey, with his daughter holding the hand of a woman he was falling in love with. Because that was the truth of it, he realized. That was the thing he'd been circling without landing on. He was falling in love with her, probably already had. He didn't say it. He filed it where he filed things that required more time. Not suppressed, not avoided, just marked for later. He was not a man who said things before he understood what he was saying, but he knew. Marcus Vane called Victoria on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. She was at the garage. She'd taken to bringing her work with her laptop, her calls, the stack of financial documents that represented the ongoing slow-motion crisis of Hale Industries Board, attempting to function without the signature of its controlling shareholder. She'd set up a kind of working station on the old metal desk in the corner of the shop that Ethan used for invoices, and he'd cleared space without comment, and they coexisted in the garage through the mornings in a companionable parallel silence that she would not have predicted she was capable of with another person. She saw Vane's name on her screen and walked outside. She was gone for 11 minutes. Ethan counted without meaning to. He was calibrated to duration the way people who'd run timed ops always were, internal clock ticking without effort. When she came back in, she looked at nothing specific for a moment, the way people do when they're integrating something that landed badly. "You okay?" he said from under the Subaru. "Fine." He rolled out, looked at her. What did he want? She put her phone in her pocket. "He's setting a deadline for the board vote. He wants my proxy or my signature on the restructuring agreement. If he doesn't have one by December, he has enough secondary shareholders to force a petition. Can he do that? Probably. My lawyers say he has 60% of the secondary float conditionally committed." She said it with the flat affect of someone who had been managing this situation from a distance long enough to have separated the emotion from the mechanics of it. What happens if he gets control? She picked up her coffee. The charitable foundation gets dissolved. The community investment arm gets liquidated. 43 employees in the Hale Foundation's education programs lose their jobs. She paused. And Marcus gets what he's wanted for 12 years, which is to put his name on something my father built. Ethan stood up, wiped his hands. How much time do you have? 6 weeks? Maybe 7? He looked at her. She looked back. You're going to have to go back, he said. I know. Not yet, she said. And then quickly, like she wanted to get in front of whatever she thought he was about to say. I know what you're going to say. What am I going to say? That I can't run forever. That the longer I'm here, the worse the board situation gets. That hiding in Millbrook isn't a strategy. I wasn't going to say any of that, he said. She stopped. I was going to ask what you need, he said. She stared at him. He went back to the Subaru. To handle it, he said. What do you need to handle it? Not what you're supposed to do. What do you actually need? A silence. I don't know, she said quietly. Okay, he said. Figure it out. I'll be here. She sat down on the step stool. He went back to work. After a while, she opened her laptop and started making calls, and the garage had both of them in it for the rest of the afternoon. And it was ordinary in a way that was becoming, Victoria thought, the most precious thing in her life, which was the problem. Because she had not told him everything about Marcus Vane. She had not told him that Marcus was not simply a board antagonist or a businessman with ambition. She had not told him that the engagement, the arrangement her family had accepted when she was 26 and not yet certain enough in herself to refuse it, was still technically on paper. That Marcus considered it a valid claim. That part of what he wanted beyond the corporate signature was her. She had not told Ethan because she did not know how to tell him without watching something in his face change, and she had become, she realized, deeply and inconveniently afraid of watching something in Ethan Cross's face change. Eat. She told Sophie by accident 10 days later. They were baking something. An attempt at brownies that was going reasonably, which in this kitchen meant the batter looked correct, and nobody had knocked anything off the counter yet. And Sophie, who asked questions without preamble and without particular concern for whether they were intrusive, looked up from the mixing bowl and said, "Does anyone in New York miss you?" Victoria thought about it. "Some people," she said. "Like who?" "My assistant, my friend Petra. The woman who does my dry cleaning who's worked there for 20 years and knows everyone's name." "What about family?" Victoria mixed the batter. "My parents died when I was young. There's an uncle who emails twice a year." Sophie absorbed this. "What about a boyfriend?" Victoria stopped mixing. Sophie watched her stop. "There was, as Victoria said carefully, an arrangement that my family made when I was young." "An arrangement?" Sophie repeated like she was testing the word. "An engagement that I didn't choose." She looked at the batter. "That I haven't fully gotten out of." Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Does Dad know?" Victoria didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Sophie picked up the spatula, scraped the sides of the bowl with the focused attention of a child who was thinking hard about something she wasn't ready to say yet. "You should tell him," she said finally. "He doesn't do well with things people don't tell him." Victoria looked at her. "What do you mean?" Sophie shrugged, in the particular way she had that meant she'd thought about something more than she was letting on. "Mom got sick and didn't tell him for a while how bad it was because she didn't want to scare him. He found out later. He was more upset about the not telling than about the rest of it." She paused. "He says he can handle hard things. He just can't handle not knowing." Victoria stood very still. "You're pretty perceptive for 8, she said. "I'm almost 9, Sophie said, "and someone has to pay attention." They put the brownies in the oven. They didn't talk about it again. That night, after Sophie was in bed and Ethan was sitting on the back porch with his coffee, Victoria sat down beside him and told him about Marcus. The engagement, the history, the specific leverage Marcus held over the board, and why it intersected with her personal life in ways she hadn't been willing to explain. She told him all of it. He listened without interrupting. He was very good at that, at holding space for a thing without reacting to it in the middle of it, a quality she'd attributed to training, but which she suspected was also just him. When she finished, there was a silence of maybe a full minute. "He thinks you'll come back and sign what he wants because the alternative is the foundation going under," Ethan said. "Yes." "And the engagement is part of the deal." "In his mind." "In anyone else's mind?" "My lawyers say it's unenforceable, but Marcus doesn't operate primarily in legal territory." Ethan drank his coffee. "He's the same man," Ethan said, "from the café." "Yes." "You knew him before that?" "Yes." Another silence. "Were you afraid of him when you walked in?" Ethan asked. She thought about it. "I was tired of being afraid of him," she said. "That's slightly different." He nodded. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he said. Not with accusation, just the question itself. She looked at her hands. "Because I was afraid of how you'd look at the situation," she said, "and what you'd decide about it." He didn't respond to that directly. He was quiet for a while, looking out at the yard, at the tire swing in the dark, at whatever he was looking at. "I'm not going to tell you to stay," he said, finally, "and I'm not going to tell you to go. I mean that." "Ethan, I'm also not going to pretend the Marcus piece is nothing," he said, "because it's not nothing, and I think you know that." "It's nothing that concerns you," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Victoria." She met his eyes. "It concerns me," he said, simply, without elaboration. She looked away first. Around them, the night settled in, the creak of the porch boards, a car passing on the far street, the interior light of Sophie's bedroom still faintly visible through the curtains because she always fell asleep reading and forgot to turn it off. "I need more time," Victoria said. "I just need a little more time here." "Okay," he said. She looked back at him. "You're not going to ask for what?" "No." She shook her head slowly, not in frustration, in something that was closer to helpless wondering. She reached over and put her hand over his on the armrest of the porch chair, and he turned his hand over and she felt his thumb against her wrist, very lightly, right where the redness had been that first morning in the cafe. They sat like that until the temperature dropped and she finally said goodnight, and he watched her walk around the side of the house to her car, and he sat another 20 minutes in the dark. He thought about Sophie's face in the parking lot, finding them in the crowd. He thought about that specific brightness that Sophie couldn't quite suppress. He thought about the man in the charcoal suit and the grip on Victoria's wrist. He thought about what it meant that Marcus Vane had surveillance on Victoria, which meant someone had tracked her to Millbrook, possibly weeks ago, which meant the address of his garage was in someone's notebook, which meant Sophie's school, Sophie's schedule, Sophie's name were potentially known quantities to a man who operated outside of legal territory by his own description. The thought didn't arrive like panic. It arrived the way threat assessments always arrived, cold, methodical, and very clear. He went inside. He locked the doors. He checked the back gate. He stood in Sophie's doorway for a moment, watching her sleep with her book fallen open on the pillow, the nightlight casting its pale arc across the floor. He made himself a second coffee he didn't drink, and he sat at the kitchen table, and he thought about what it meant to love someone and what it meant to have a daughter, and whether those two things could live in the same space when one of them brought this specific kind of danger into a town that hadn't, until now, had any. He didn't sleep until nearly 3 a.m., and even then, not well. He was still sitting at the table at 6 when his phone buzzed with a news notification, and he picked it up, and the headline read, Hale Industries Board announces press event, CEO Marcus Vane to address heiress situation and upcoming leadership transition. He read it twice. Then he set the phone down, got up, and went to start Sophie's breakfast, because Sophie had school in 90 minutes. And whatever else was happening in the world, that was still true and always would be. And some things you held on to not because they were easy, but because they were yours. But his hands were not entirely steady on the pan. And for the first time in 4 years, for the first time since he'd stood in a hospital corridor and understood what the doctor was telling him, Ethan Cross felt the particular cold arithmetic of a situation with no clean exit, closing around the edges of the life he had built. The headline stayed on Ethan's phone screen like something he needed to read a third time before it would fully resolve. Hale Industries Board announces press event, CEO Marcus Vane to address heiress situation and upcoming leadership transition. He made Sophie's breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice from a carton that was 2 days from expiring. He moved through it mechanically, the way he moved through things when his mind was elsewhere, body on autopilot, trained routines doing the work while the actual thinking happened in a quieter layer underneath. Sophie came downstairs at 6:42 in her school clothes, sat down and looked at the eggs. "You burned the edges again," she said. "They're fine. The edges are crispy." "That's texture." She ate them anyway, without further complaint, which meant she wasn't trying to win that particular argument, just register it. Ethan sat across from her with his coffee and watched her eat and thought about what he was going to do about Victoria, and whether those were even separable questions anymore. What to do about Victoria and what to do about the situation, because they had, somewhere in the last 7 weeks, become the same question. He drove Sophie to school. She got out, didn't look back, same as always. He drove to the shop. He didn't call Victoria. He told himself he was giving her time to see the headline on her own, process it, decide how to handle it, because she was a grown woman who'd been managing Marcus Vane's ambitions for years before Ethan Cross had ever heard of either of them. He told himself this was respect, that stepping back was the appropriate move. He was also, and he was honest enough to know it, afraid of what the conversation would be, petit desaturusam, because the headline wasn't just a board announcement, it was a signal. Leadership transition. Vane was moving, publicly, loudly, with the confidence of a man who had done the math and liked his numbers, which meant he'd already moved privately in ways that weren't yet visible, which meant the 6-week window Victoria had mentioned was probably already shorter, which meant she was leaving. Not maybe. Not eventually. Soon. He opened the shop. He turned on the radio. He started work on a Chevy pickup that needed a new alternator, and he worked through it methodically. Test the charging system, confirm the fault, disconnect the battery, remove the serpentine belt, and he did not think about Victoria. And he thought about nothing but Victoria, which was its own kind of problem. She called at 9:15. "I saw it," she said, when he picked up. "I figured." A pause. He moved the timeline up. "The press event is Thursday. That's 2 days." "I know. My lawyer says if I'm not there to respond personally, it looks like I've conceded the position. He says Marcus can potentially use my absence as grounds for a competency challenge, which is, it's a stretch. But Marcus has 3 judges on his donor list and a PR team that's been running a narrative about me being unstable since August." Ethan was quiet. "Ethan, I hear you. Say something." He put down the socket wrench. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Something." He leaned against the truck. "You have to go," he said. The silence on her end lasted long enough that he counted it. 7 seconds. "I know," she said. "Okay." "That's it? Okay?" "What else would I say?" "I don't know." Her voice was careful in a way that meant it was working to stay that way. "Something about what happens after. Something about—" She stopped. "Victoria, don't be calm right now," she said. "It's very annoying. Despite everything, something in him that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. You want me to be upset? I want you to act like this matters." "It matters," he said. Flat and certain, no performance in it at all. Another pause. "I'll be back," she said. "Once I deal with the board and the press and Marcus, I'll come back." He heard it. The thing under the sentence, the piece she wasn't saying. She believed it when she said it. He believed she believed it. That wasn't the same as being sure it was true, and they both knew that, and neither of them said it, which was its own kind of honesty. "Have dinner with us tonight," he said, "before you go." She came. Shab. The dinner was Sophie's idea, technically. She'd decided it should be tacos, had written a specific list of ingredients, and had supervised both adults in the kitchen with the authority of a small executive chef who had strong opinions about the ratio of lime to sour cream and was not interested in compromise. They ate at the kitchen table under the yellow light of the bulb that still needed replacing, and it was easy, and it was hard in equal measure, and nobody said the word goodbye because Sophie had apparently decided that word was not permitted, and Ethan and Victoria both let her make that rule. After dinner, Victoria helped Sophie with a reading assignment, something about ecosystems, a chapter in a textbook, and Victoria sat on the couch beside Sophie, and they went through it together with Sophie asking questions that wandered far beyond the chapter's actual scope, and Victoria answering all of them without shortcutting, which Sophie noticed and appreciated in the way she appreciated things, quietly, through continued engagement by not leaving. Ethan washed the dishes and listened to them from the kitchen. At 9, Sophie was in bed. Victoria stood in the hallway outside Sophie's door with her jacket over her arm, and Ethan leaned against the wall across from her, and they looked at each other in the way people look at each other when they've run out of practical things to say, and the real things feel too large and too risky for a hallway at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday. "I'll call when I land," she said. "Okay, and I'll—" She stopped, started again. "I meant what I said about coming back." He looked at her. "I know." She stepped forward and put one hand flat on his chest for a moment. Not a hug, not a kiss, just contact, brief and deliberate. And then she pulled her hand back and walked down the stairs and out the front door, and he heard her car start, and he stood in the hallway for a while after the sound of the engine faded. He went to check on Sophie. She was awake, lying in the dark with her eyes open. "Is she gone?" Sophie said. "She had to go to New York." "Is she coming back?" "That's the plan." Sophie was quiet. "What's the plan exactly?" she said. "She handles some business, then she comes back." Another silence. "But you're not sure," Sophie said. "Go to sleep, Soph." She didn't say anything else. He turned off the nightlight. She'd asked him to start doing that recently, said she was too old for it, which he disagreed with but deferred to, and he pulled her door halfway closed and stood in the upstairs hall. He was not sure. Imet. Victoria called from the plane before takeoff, which was technically not allowed and which she did anyway. "Sophie awake?" she asked. Probably. Tell her a pause. Tell her the ecosystem chapter thing about decomposers is going to be on a test eventually. I'd put money on it. I'll tell her. Ethan? Yeah. The pause this time was different, longer. He could hear the ambient sound of the cabin around her, other passengers, the loading process. Thank you, she said, for all of it. The coffee and the shop and the dinners and… She stopped. I'm not saying this right. You're saying it fine. I feel like I owe you an apology and I don't entirely know what for. He thought about that. You don't, he said. Go handle your thing. A beat. Okay, she said, quietly. Call when you land. She did. He was already asleep when it came in. He'd finally gone down at 11, the first genuinely deep sleep he'd managed in days, and he saw the missed call in the morning and the text beneath it. Landed. New York at 1 a.m. is something else. Talk tomorrow. He typed back. Good. He stared at the word, added, glad you're safe, sent it, put the phone in his pocket, got Sophie up for school. She called every 2 or 3 days in the first week. The calls were mostly about the board situation. Vane's press conference had been contentious. Her lawyers had issued a response. There were counterfilings and statements and a meeting scheduled with 3 major institutional shareholders that Victoria described with the flat efficiency of someone managing a war on multiple fronts simultaneously. She was competent at it. More than competent. She was precise and strategic, and clearly formidable in that specific world. And Ethan listened to all of it and asked questions that were practical and useful. And at the end of each call, she always pivoted to Sophie, asking about school, asking about the science project, asking about the boy named Marcus from the dinosaur argument, who had apparently shown up again in Sophie's orbit and was now a recurring source of mild academic drama. He noticed she asked about Sophie before she asked about him. He noticed, and he understood it, and he filed it where he filed things that told him something important without being fully readable yet. In the second week, the calls got shorter. Not cold. She wasn't pulling back in any obvious way, wasn't distant or clipped, but they got shorter, and there were more days between them, and twice she texted instead of calling, which was different, and he noticed that too. He told himself it was the pressure of the situation, the board, the lawyers, the PR war. Marcus Vane, with his donor list judges and his narrative about an unstable heiress. Of course she was stretched. Of course the calls got shorter when she was managing a crisis. He told himself this and he believed it, and he also knew, in the part of himself that had been trained to read rooms and situations without the comfort of wishful thinking, that something else was happening, something he couldn't see from Millbrook. Sophie noticed too, though she didn't say it directly. She started checking Ethan's phone when news alerts came in, which she'd never done before. She started asking about Victoria in a way that was slightly too casual, slightly too studied in its carelessness, which was the specific kind of asking that means you're scared of the answer. 3 weeks after Victoria left, Sophie came home from school, dropped her bag, and sat at the kitchen table without her usual immediate raid of the pantry, which was a behavioral anomaly significant enough that Ethan put down the invoice he was working on. How was school, La? He said. Fine. How was the math test? Fine. He looked at her. You okay? She shrugged. Sophie. She looked at the table. When's Victoria coming back? I don't know exactly. She's still dealing with… Is she coming back? The way she said it, flat and direct and braced, the way you asked a question when you were ready for a bad answer and wanted to get to it before hope accumulated any further, that put a specific pressure behind Ethan's sternum that had nothing to do with his own feelings and everything to do with hers. That's the plan, he said. Sophie looked up at him. You keep saying that. That's the plan. But you look like you're not sure. I'm not sure of everything. Nobody is. Dad? Her voice was very steady. Is she coming back or not? He held her eyes. He did not lie to Sophie. It was a commitment he'd made without ceremony years ago because Sophie had a detector for it and also because she deserved better. I don't know, he said. Sophie nodded, slowly, like she'd already known and was just confirming. Did something happen? She asked. Did you do something? No. Did she? No. It's complicated, Soph. I know her life is complicated, Sophie said, and there was something sharp in it, not at him, just sharpness from pain trying to find a direction. Her life was complicated here too. She was still here. He didn't have a good answer to that. Sophie pushed her chair back and went upstairs. He heard her door close. Not slammed, just closed, which was, somehow, harder. He called Victoria that evening. Not the day's normal time, not the routine call, just called because he needed to have a specific conversation he'd been putting off. She picked up on the third ring. He could hear the difference in the background, the particular indoor quiet of a large apartment or office, not the cafe sounds or street noise that had been behind her in the early calls. "Hey," she said. "Hey, is this a bad time?" "No, I just got out of a meeting." A pause. "You sound different." "Sophie asked today if you're coming back." A longer pause. "What did you tell her?" Victoria said. "That I didn't know." He heard her exhale. "Victoria. Ethan, talk to me. Not the board stuff. Talk to me." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight, the kind where something was being decided on the other end of it. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally. "From here. I look at what it would actually look like. Me going back to Millbrook, figuring out what that means for the company, dealing with Marcus, and also—" She stopped. "Also being in your life, in Sophie's life, in a real way, not a visiting way, and I can't see it clearly. I'm not asking you to see it clearly. I know, but I need to. I need to be able to see the shape of it before I—" She caught herself. "I'm not explaining this right." "You're explaining it fine," he said, which was what he'd said on the phone at the airport, and which meant the same thing now. "I hear the real thing you're saying." "I don't want to be something that happens to Sophie and then leaves," Victoria said, and her voice was very quiet and very careful. "I can't be that for her." "Then don't be." "Ethan, it's not that simple." "I know it's not simple." "Do you?" "Because from Millbrook, it probably looks like you're scared," he said. Another silence. "Of what?" she said. "Of getting it wrong, of wanting something real, and then—" He stopped. He was moving into territory he hadn't fully mapped, and he was aware of it. "You came to Millbrook running from something. You stayed because you found something else. And now you're in New York, and you can see both of those things, and they don't fit together easily, and so you're—" He looked for the right word. "Stalling." "I'm not stalling." "Okay. I'm managing a real and serious corporate crisis." "I know." "And my personal life is—" "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to choose right now. I'm asking you to call Sophie." A pause. "Call Sophie," he said. "Not me. Call Sophie and tell her yourself that you're not gone. Whatever else is true, do that part." He heard her breathing. "Okay," she said. "I will. Tonight." "Tonight," she said. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a while. Then he went upstairs and knocked on Sophie's door and said, "Victoria's going to call you tonight." And Sophie opened the door and looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read and said, "Okay," and then went back to her desk and pretended to do homework. Victoria called at 8:30. Ethan stayed downstairs. He couldn't hear the specific words, just the sound of Sophie's voice, the pattern of it, question and answer and question, the way it softened somewhere in the first few minutes and stayed soft. 40 minutes on the phone. He tracked it by the kitchen clock without meaning to. When Sophie came downstairs, she looked lighter by a specific degree that was hard to quantify but impossible to miss. "She's coming back in 2 weeks," Sophie said. "She says." "Good." Sophie looked at him. "She says there's still stuff to deal with, but she's coming back for a weekend at least, and then we figure out the rest." "That sounds right." Sophie nodded. She went to the pantry and finally got the crackers she'd clearly been planning to get since she came home and hadn't, and she ate them at the counter and looked at nothing in particular, and Ethan thought, 2 weeks, and then we figure out the rest. He could work with that. Except he couldn't, and he found this out 11 days later in a way he hadn't prepared for. He found it out from Sophie. It was a Sunday morning, and they were at Archer's Café, which had become a weekend ritual. Sophie had pancakes, Ethan had eggs. Donna pretended not to be invested in their lives while being transparently invested in their lives. Sophie had her phone out, which Ethan usually redirected, but she was reading something with an intensity that made him hold off. "Dad?" Sophie said, something in her voice. He looked up from his eggs. She turned her phone around and showed him the screen. It was a news article. Entertainment, business crossover. The kind of thing that ran in the 3 or 4 outlets that covered the intersection of corporate power and social pages. The headline read, "Victoria Hale reportedly accepts renewed engagement terms. Hale-Vane alliance signals board peace deal." Beneath it, a photograph taken 2 nights ago at some kind of event. A gala, the caption said. A fundraiser at the Metropolitan something. Attendees in formal wear. Marcus Vane in a suit that probably cost more than Ethan's truck and half the equipment in the shop. And Victoria beside him, in a dark dress, her hand on his arm, looking at the camera with an expression that was composed and unreadable, and to Ethan completely familiar. It was the expression she wore when she was managing a situation, when the face and the reality behind it were 2 different things. But her hand was on his arm. And the article said renewed engagement terms. Ethan looked at the photograph for a long time. Sophie was watching him. "Dad," she said carefully, "are you okay?" "Yeah," he said. "That's not—" She stopped. "That doesn't mean it's real, right? You said she was dealing with the board. You said, 'I know what I said.' So it might be a business thing, like a strategy." He put the phone down on the table, face down. "Might be," he said. But his voice came out flat in a way he hadn't intended, and Sophie heard it, and she looked at him with those dark brown eyes that were her mother's eyes, and she didn't say anything else, which was its own kind of answer. He called Victoria that afternoon. She didn't pick up. He texted, "Saw the article. Call me when you can." He didn't say, "I need to understand what I'm looking at." He didn't say, "Sophie showed it to me at breakfast, and I watched something in her face go out like a light." He didn't say any of it, just, "Call me when you can." She called 3 hours later. "I was going to call you," she said before he spoke. "I was going to explain. Explain it now." The board needed a public signal. Marcus agreed to back off the proxy challenge if I appeared with him at the gala. My lawyers said it was the cleanest path to— The article says engagement. A pause. It says reportedly. It's a gossip item. It's not a— Victoria. The engagement terms are something Marcus is representing publicly, but I haven't signed anything. I haven't agreed to anything formally. It's a— Is it real or isn't it? The silence was 3 seconds. "It's complicated," she said. 3 seconds. That was all he needed. "Okay," he said. "Ethan, don't do that. Don't shut down. I can explain this if you let me." "You've been explaining things since the beginning," he said. Not angry, and that was the strange part. He wasn't angry. He was just very clear in a way that felt like glass. The engagement, the board, Marcus, the leverage. Every time there's another layer, and I'm not— He stopped. Started again. "I'm not in that world. I can't see it from here. I can't know which pieces are strategy and which ones are real. They're all strategy. Marcus is not— He had his hand on your waist in a photograph." Silence. "Sophie saw it," Ethan said. The silence shifted. "Ethan, I would never— I know," he said. And he did know. He believed her about Marcus, about what it was and wasn't. That wasn't the problem. "I know you wouldn't. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" He thought about Sophie at the cafe, phone turned around, watching his face. He thought about the cup Sophie put on the table every morning Victoria was there, the way Sophie had stopped putting it out the second week after Victoria left and hadn't started again. He thought about Sophie's voice upstairs during a 40-minute phone call, going soft in the first few minutes and staying soft. "I can't let Sophie get more attached than she already is," he said. "Not while I don't know what you're going to decide. I've decided you're still engaged, publicly, on a gossip page with a photograph, but still, you're still in a board fight that might end with you running a company from New York for the next 10 years. You're still—" He stopped. "You're still in a world I can't put Sophie inside of, not without knowing what it actually looks like." "What does that mean?" Victoria said. Her voice had gone very careful. It means I need to stop. He said it quietly. For Sophie, not forever. But I need to know what you're actually choosing before I let her get any closer to this. A very long silence. You're ending it, Victoria said. I'm pausing it. That's the same thing. He didn't argue, because she might be right. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it in the way you meant things that were true and terrible at the same time. This isn't about not wanting you. You know that. She didn't respond for a moment. When she did, her voice was level in the way voices got level when someone was working very hard to keep them that way. I understand, she said. Victoria, no, I understand. A pause. You're protecting her. I can't argue with that. I'm not trying to hurt you. I know. I just can't, Ethan. Her voice was quiet and final. I know. He held the phone. Take care of her, Victoria said. I will. The line went quiet. He held the phone against his ear for another moment, the way you stayed on a call after it ended, trying to keep the connection one more second, which was its own kind of answer about what he was actually feeling. Then he put the phone down. He sat at the kitchen table. Outside, through the window, the November afternoon was gray and still. The oak tree bare now, the tire swing hanging motionless in the cold. The yard looked different without leaves, more exposed, all its structure visible and the softness gone. He heard Sophie come downstairs. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at him. She looked at his face, specifically with that particular reading she did, the one that caught things he didn't say, and something in her own face changed. Dad, she said. Soph, what did you do? It wasn't a question, the flatness of it, the certainty. She'd already assembled it. I ended it, he said. For now. Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Why, she said. To protect you. The words hung in the air between them. Sophie's jaw tightened. A small motion, slight, but he knew her face the way you knew the face of someone you'd watched grow from infancy, and he saw it. He saw the thing under it, the grief that was trying to become anger because anger was easier to carry. I didn't ask you to protect me from her, Sophie said. Soph, but I didn't ask you that. Her voice climbed 1 degree. I never asked you that. I know. Then why? Because you're 8 and I'm your father, and this is my job. Your job? She repeated it like she was tasting how wrong it was. Your job was to not send away the only person who made us feel like a family again. The sentence hit him like something physical. He didn't respond. He didn't have an immediate response, because the sentence was true enough that it required sitting with rather than reacting to, and he sat with it, and Sophie stood in the doorway and looked at him with her arms crossed, and her mother's eyes full of something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but was some painful compound of both. She wasn't going to hurt me, Sophie said. She wasn't like... She was real, Dad. She was real with us. I know she was. Then why does real have to leave? He didn't have an answer. He sat at the table in the kitchen with the gray November light coming through the window, and his daughter stood in the doorway looking at him with an expression that was going to stay with him, he knew, for a very long time. You were scared, Sophie said, flat and quiet and 8 years old and completely accurate. You were scared, so you made her go away before she could leave on her own. She uncrossed her arms, looked at the floor. That's what you did. She went back upstairs. The tire swing outside was perfectly still. Ethan Cross sat alone in his kitchen and found that he had absolutely nothing to argue with. The week after Sophie said what she said, Ethan Cross was the worst version of himself. Not visibly. Not in any way that would have been obvious to someone who didn't know him. He got up on time, made breakfast, drove Sophie to school, opened the shop, worked through the day, closed up, made dinner, checked homework, said goodnight. The exterior held. It always held. That was the thing about 12 years of operating in environments where falling apart was a tactical liability. The exterior held even when the interior was something else entirely. But he burned a pan of eggs on Tuesday because he stood at the stove not moving for 4 minutes. He over-tightened a lug nut on a Honda Civic on Wednesday and had to start over. On Thursday, he drove to the school for pickup and sat in the parking lot 11 minutes before remembering Sophie had an after-school project and wasn't coming out yet. He was not okay. He was functional, which was a different thing. Sophie was quieter than usual, which for Sophie meant a specific kind of quiet that had texture to it. Not silence. She still talked, still had opinions about dinner and Marcus from school, and whether decomposers were genuinely underappreciated in the ecosystem curriculum. But the particular quality of her noise had changed. The lightness was gone. She was going through the motions with the same mechanical competence her father was, which was its own kind of evidence of what they'd lost. She didn't bring up Victoria. He didn't bring up Victoria. They ate dinner across from each other under the yellow light and talked about school and the weather and whether the Civic's owner had ever considered that consistent maintenance was actually cheaper than periodic crisis. And they were both so careful with each other that the carefulness itself was the loudest thing in the room. On Friday evening, Ethan was in the garage at home, not working on anything specific, just organizing, which was what he did when he needed to do something with his hands without having to think. When he heard Sophie come through the side door, she stood in the garage doorway and watched him reorganize a shelf of supplies that did not need reorganizing. "You're doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where you move stuff around that's already fine." He put down a can of WD-40. You do it when you're thinking about something and you don't want to think about it," she said. "You did it for like 3 weeks after Mom died." He turned and looked at his daughter. She was standing in the garage doorway in her socks and her school sweatshirt, arms loose at her sides, watching him with an expression that was careful and sad and more adult than he was entirely comfortable with. "I'm fine," he said. "Dad." "Sophie, you're not fine." She said it without accusation, just as a fact she'd observed and decided to name. "You miss her." He didn't answer. "And you sent her away," Sophie said, "because you were scared. And now you're in the garage moving the WD-40. He picked up the can again, set it down. "It's more complicated than that." "You always say that when it isn't." She leaned against the door frame. "Dad, do you love her?" He was quiet for a long moment. "That's not the only thing that matters," he said. "It's the main thing," Sophie said. "Isn't it?" He looked at his daughter. She looked back at him, all 4'4" of her, in her socks, with her mother's eyes, and her mother's particular way of cutting directly to the thing without apologizing for it. And he thought about how Claire had been exactly like that. How Claire had looked at him across a kitchen table 15 years ago and said, "You love me, Ethan Cross, just say it." And he'd spent 20 minutes finding other ways to describe it before she'd started laughing at him. He thought about Sophie saying, "You were scared, so you made her go away before she could leave on her own." He had been telling himself for a week that the decision was about Sophie, that ending things with Victoria was an act of parenting, of protection, of prioritizing his daughter's well-being over his own wants. Standing in the garage on a Friday evening with Sophie watching him reorganize supplies that didn't need it, he admitted to himself, quietly, without drama, that he had been telling himself a partial truth. The part that was convenient, the part that let him be the reasonable man, the careful father, the one who made the hard call. The other part was simpler and less flattering. He had been terrified, not of Victoria, not of her money or her world or Marcus Vane, terrified of what it would mean to fully let her in, to let Sophie fully let her in, to build something real and then have it end. Because things ended, he knew better than most how absolutely things ended. And to watch Sophie survive that, to survive it himself. He'd done what he'd always done when the risk exceeded his tolerance. He'd controlled the exit. He'd left before he could be left. He'd dressed it up as protection, and it was in part protection, but underneath it was just fear, with a good reason attached. Sophie had seen it in about 48 hours. He'd taken a week and some WD-40. "Yeah," he said finally. "I love her." Sophie nodded, like this confirmed something she'd already known and had been waiting for him to catch up to. "So what are you going to do about it?" she said. He looked at the garage, at the shelf, at the can in his hand. "I don't know yet," he said. "Okay," Sophie said. "Figure it out." She turned to go back inside, stopped. "But Dad?" "Yeah." "Don't take another week." She went inside. He stood in the garage alone. He put the can of WD-40 back exactly where it had been. He started figuring it out the next morning. Not with a plan, exactly. Plans required more information than he had, and the first thing he needed was information. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his phone, and he pulled up everything that had run in the financial and business press in the last 3 weeks. The board situation, the engagement reports, the counterfilings his lawyers had issued, the response from Vane's communications team, the statement Victoria's own PR had released, which was brief and non-committal, and told him almost nothing about what was actually happening. He read it all. Twice. Then he called the one person he knew who operated in adjacent territory. Ray Drummond, formerly Chief Petty Officer, currently running a private security consultancy out of Dallas that had clients in exactly the kind of world Victoria moved in. Ethan hadn't called Ray in 8 months. Ray picked up in 2 rings. "Cross," Ray said, the sound of him eating something crunchy. "You still eat at 9 a.m. I eat constantly. It's a metabolism thing." A pause. "What do you need?" "Information, corporate. What do you know about Hale Industries and a man named Marcus Vane?" A short silence. "This for personal or professional?" "Personal." "How personal?" "The kind where I need to understand what I'm looking at before I make a decision that matters." Another pause. Longer. Ray Drummond eating something. "Give me a few hours. I know people in that sector. I'll see what I can find that isn't in the press." "I appreciate it." "Cross." Ray's voice shifted. Not softer. Ray didn't do soft, but more direct. "You doing all right?" "Getting there." "That's not a yes." "No," Ethan said. "It's not." Ray called back at noon with information that was more useful than anything the press had run. The engagement was what Victoria had described. Strategic, not genuine. A negotiated public signal designed to give Vane the optics of alignment without legally binding Victoria to anything. But Ray's contact in the New York corporate world added a piece Ethan hadn't known. Vane's position was weaker than it looked. 2 of the 3 institutional shareholders he'd committed to his proxy challenge had gotten cold feet after a regulatory inquiry into one of Vane's subsidiary companies. His 60% was now, according to Ray's contact, closer to 45. He needed Victoria's signature urgently, not because he was winning, but because he was in danger of losing and needed to close the deal before it collapsed. The engagement wasn't a done thing. It was a last card. "The woman in question," Ray said carefully. "She knows all this?" "Probably," Ethan said. "She's smart. So the question is what she's going to do about it." "The question," Ethan said, "is what I'm going to do about it." A pause. "Ah," Ray said. "Yeah." "Does this involve a drive to New York?" Ethan looked at his kitchen, at the table with the chairs, at the yellow light that still needed replacing, at the refrigerator covered in Sophie's drawings and school schedules, and one particular photograph from September, Archer's Café, taken by Donna without asking, printed and taped up by Sophie. Ethan on one side, Victoria on the other, Sophie between them with a granola bar, all 3 of them not looking at the camera, all 3 of them mid-conversation, the kind of photograph that captured something real, because nobody had time to arrange their faces. "Probably," Ethan said. "You need anything?" "Just the address of the event." Vane's announcement, the press event Victoria had mentioned, the formal announcement that had been rescheduled twice and was now set for the following Saturday at the Caldwell Hotel in Manhattan. Ray had it. He sent it over. Ethan looked at the address. He looked at the photograph on the refrigerator. He called Sophie down from upstairs. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, assessed his expression, and said, "You figured it out." "Working on it." "What's the plan?" "I need to go to New York," he said. "This Saturday." She considered this. For Victoria. For a lot of things. But yeah. Sophie crossed the kitchen and looked at the photograph on the refrigerator. The one Donna had taken. The one Sophie had taped up. The one Ethan had left there because taking it down felt like making a decision he wasn't ready to make. "I want to come," Sophie said. "You've got... Dad?" He looked at her. "I want to come," she said again. Simple. Non-negotiable. He thought about it for about 4 seconds. "Pack light," he said. They left Saturday morning at 5 a.m. Sophie slept in the back seat for the first 2 hours. Ethan drove through the dark with the radio low and his thoughts running in the ordered way they ran before an operation. Not calm exactly, but organized. He'd learned early in his SEAL career that the difference between fear and readiness was mostly architecture. Fear was the same information, just unsorted. You took the same facts, the same unknowns, the same risks, and you built a structure around them, and then you had readiness. He went over it. What he knew, what he didn't, what the objective was. Not a takedown, not an extraction, just a conversation with an audience present in a room where the woman he loved was about to make a decision that would affect the rest of her life. And she was going to make it without the information that he had been too afraid to give her. That she was not in this alone. That Sophie's cup was still on the table in his mind, set for 3. That whatever the world she lived in looked like from New York, from a boardroom, from a gala photograph with Marcus Vane's hand near her waist. It also looked like a September afternoon in a garage in Millbrook, with the light coming in at an angle, and 2 coffees, and nothing demanding anything from either of them. He wanted her to have both pieces of information before she chose. Sophie woke up somewhere in New Jersey, ate a granola bar she'd packed, and looked out the window at the highway. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "A little." "About what specifically?" "Walking into a room full of people I don't know to tell someone something in public that I should have said in private weeks ago." Sophie considered this. "Is that the embarrassing part or the hard part?" "Both." "Which one is worse?" He thought about it. "The hard part." "What's the hard part?" "Saying that I was wrong," he said, "about why I did what I did." Sophie turned from the window. "That's not that hard, Dad." "Easy to say at 8. "Mom said you had a problem with it," Sophie said. "Not cruel, just factual. She said you could be wrong about something for a really long time before you'd admit it out loud." He looked at the road. "She wasn't wrong." "She usually wasn't." A pause. "But she also said you always got there eventually. She said once you got there you were very... What was the word?" Sophie frowned, remembering. "Unflinching. She said you were unflinching about it." He drove. "That was her favorite thing about you," Sophie said. "She told me that, right before she died. She said, your dad gets scared sometimes, but once he knows the true thing, he doesn't flinch from it. She said to remember that." He kept his eyes on the road. "I didn't tell you before," Sophie said, "because I didn't think you needed to hear it yet." He glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror. "Sophie Cross," he said. "You are something else." "I know," she said, and looked back out the window. Mats. The Caldwell Hotel was 42 floors of glass and steel in Midtown Manhattan, and it announced itself with the specific confidence of a building that had never once questioned its own relevance. The event was on the 31st floor, a ballroom space that Vane's team had booked for 200 guests, institutional investors, board members, media, the particular class of New York attendee for whom this kind of event was a regular Tuesday, regardless of the day of the week. Ethan found a parking garage 6 blocks out. He and Sophie walked. Sophie had dressed with the seriousness she brought to school presentations. Dark jeans, a blue sweater, her hair actually fully braided for the first time in recent memory, which she'd done herself in the car using a technique she'd seen in a video and executed with the concentration of a watchmaker. "You look nice," he said. "I look appropriate," she corrected. "There's a difference." He was wearing his one good jacket, dark navy, no grease, he'd checked twice, over a clean shirt. He didn't own anything that would pass in a room of 200 New York investors, and he'd decided somewhere around the Delaware border that this was fine. He was not going in disguised as someone he wasn't. He was going in as exactly who he was. At the hotel entrance, a man with a tablet checked names. They were not on any list. Ethan told the man they were there for the Hale Industries announcement. The man looked at his tablet, looked at Ethan, looked at Sophie, looked back at Ethan. "I don't have you registered," the man said. "I know," Ethan said. "I can't admit guests who—" "Victoria Hale," Ethan said. "Tell her that Ethan Cross is here, from Millbrook." The man looked uncertain. "Sir, this is a private—" "Tell her," Ethan said. "That's all I'm asking." The man made a call, speaking low, and while he did, Sophie stood beside Ethan and looked at the hotel lobby with the evaluating expression she used on everything new, cataloging, assessing, deciding where she stood on the matter. "Big," she said quietly. "Yeah. Lots of marble." "Yeah. Bet the parking is expensive." "I'm not thinking about that right now." The man lowered his phone. His expression had shifted. Less certain, more careful. "Someone will come down to meet you," he said. They waited 7 minutes. The woman who came down was not Victoria. She was Victoria's assistant. Her name was Priya, 30s, efficient, clearly someone who managed complex situations without requiring instructions. And she looked at Ethan with an expression that was professionally unreadable and said, "Mr. Cross, she didn't know you were coming." "I know," Ethan said. Priya looked at Sophie. Something in her face adjusted. "Is this—" "Sophie," Sophie said, extending her hand. Priya shook it, with the slightly startled look of an adult who hadn't expected a child to be direct about a handshake. "Come with me," she said. She didn't take them to Victoria. She took them to a small anteroom off the main hall. A holding space, technically, the kind of room that existed in event venues for exactly these situations. People who needed to be managed before being introduced to the main event. She said Victoria was currently in a pre-announcement meeting with board members, that the public event started in 30 minutes, that she would try to get word to Victoria before it began. Then she left them there. Sophie sat in one of the chairs and looked at her phone. Ethan stood. He could hear, through the walls and the distant hum of 31 floors of hotel operations, the sound of the event coming together. Voices, a PA system being checked, the particular white noise of 200 people finding their places. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't have saved. "You're here." He stared at it. Another text, 2 seconds later. "Priya told me, are you actually here?" He typed back yes. A pause. Then, why? He thought about what to type. He thought about the conversation in the car and what Sophie had said about Claire and the word unflinching and the drive through the dark at 5 a.m. with Sophie asleep in the back seat. He typed, "Because I made a mistake and I need to say it in person. And because Sophie's with me." She wanted to come. He watched the 3 dots appear, disappear, appear again. Then, "The event starts in 25 minutes. I have to be out there." "I know." Another pause. "There are 200 people in that room, Ethan. I know that too." The dots appeared and stayed longer this time. Then, "I can't walk out of it." The announcement, "I'm not asking you to walk out of anything. I'm asking for 5 minutes before it starts." No response for 90 seconds. Then Priya opened the anteroom door. "She has 4 minutes, Priya said. "Come now." Sophie looked up from her phone. She and Ethan looked at each other. "Go," Sophie said. "I'm fine here." "You sure?" She held up her phone. "I have decomposer videos." He followed Priya down a corridor that ran behind the main ballroom. Service passage, bare walls, fluorescent light, the back-of-house reality that every formal event kept hidden from its guests. Through one wall he could hear the growing sound of the crowd. Priya stopped at a door, knocked twice, opened it without waiting for an answer. It was a small room, a mirror, a table, the practical space that existed for presenters to collect themselves before going out. Victoria was standing in the middle of it. She was in a dark green dress he hadn't seen before, her hair up, pearl earrings he recognized from the gala photograph, the one Sophie had shown him at breakfast. And she looked at him when he came through the door with an expression that was complicated in the way only a face could be complicated when it was doing several different things at once. 4 minutes, Priya said from the doorway, and then she left. They were alone. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Victoria looked at him. He looked at her. He could hear his own heartbeat. Not fast, not panicked, just present, the way it had been in every high-stakes moment of his life, reminding him that he was alive and this was real. "You drove 5 hours," she said. "Yes." "With Sophie?" She insisted. Something moved across her face. She pressed her lips together briefly, composing something. "Ethan," "Let me go first," he said. She stopped. "I sent you away," he said, "and I told myself it was about Sophie. And it was, partly. But mostly it was about me. About being scared of what it meant if I let you in completely, and then—" He stopped. Started again. "I did the same thing I always do. I ran an assessment, identified the risk, controlled the exit before the exit could happen to me." He looked at her directly. "I was wrong. The mistake wasn't loving you. The mistake was deciding my fear was a good enough reason to hurt you." Victoria was very still. "I'm not asking you to forget the last 3 weeks," he said. "I'm not asking you to make a decision tonight about what any of this looks like going forward. I know you've got a room full of people out there and a board situation and things I can't fully see from Millbrook." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. "I'm asking you to look at this first." He held it out. A drawing, 8 by 11, folded twice. He unfolded it carefully. Sophie's handwriting at the top, in purple marker, slightly uneven. "Our family." And below it, 3 figures in crayon. The rough, fully committed way Sophie drew when she was drawing something she cared about. Not careful, not precise, just real. A tall figure with dark hair and what was clearly a work jacket. A small figure with a very large braided ponytail. And a third figure, same height as the tall one, in a green dress, between them, all 3 of them holding hands in the unself-conscious way children drew the things they loved. Victoria looked at the drawing. She looked at it for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. Not spilling, just the boundary of it, the edge where composure and something more honest were pressing against each other. "She drew this?" Victoria said. "Last week." He paused. "She didn't tell me she was doing it. I found it on the kitchen table with a sticky note that said," he almost smiled, "in case you need this." Victoria looked at the drawing again. "I'm not asking you to come back to Millbrook tonight," Ethan said. "I'm not asking you to give up anything in that room. I'm asking you to know, before you go out there, that there is a little girl in an anteroom down the hall who drew you into her family in purple marker, and that I love you, and that I should have been brave enough to say both of those things before I sent you away." His voice was completely level. He was not performing. He was just saying the true thing, the way Sophie had told him he eventually always did. Victoria looked at him. Her chest rose and fell once. "Ethan Cross," she said very quietly. "Yeah." She reached out and took the drawing from him, held it in both hands the way she'd held her coffee cup that first morning in Archer's Café, with both hands, like something that needed to be kept warm, like something she was afraid of putting down. "I need to go out there," she said. "I know. And I need to make a decision out there that I've been trying to avoid making for 2 months. I know. And I can't—" She stopped. "I can't promise you how this goes." "I know that too." She looked at the drawing one more time, then she looked at him. "Where will you be?" she said. "Right here," he said. Her jaw tightened for a moment. That small motion he knew now, the one that meant she was holding something. And then she nodded, once, and she straightened, and she turned toward the door. "Victoria," he said. She stopped. "Sophie's phone number is in the margin of the drawing," he said. "Bottom right corner. She wrote it there herself." Victoria looked at the drawing, found it. Sophie's handwriting, small and deliberate. A phone number, and underneath it, in smaller letters still, "Call me when it's over." Something broke open in Victoria's face, briefly, completely, and then she closed it again. Not against it, just closing over it, keeping it inside where it belonged. She walked out the door. "Oops." Ethan went back to the anteroom. Sophie looked up when he came in, read his face. "How'd it go?" "She took the drawing." Sophie nodded. "Good." She looked at the door, then back at her phone. "Now we wait?" "Now we wait." He sat in the chair beside his daughter. The room hummed with the distant sound of 200 people in a PA system and the particular weight of a thing that was happening on the other side of a wall and couldn't be controlled from here. Sophie leaned her head against his arm. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They sat like that in the small back room of the Caldwell Hotel, while the world on the other side of the wall did what it was going to do. Then, 26 minutes later, Sophie's phone rang. She looked at the screen, looked at Ethan. Her expression, the brightness she hadn't let herself show in 3 weeks, suddenly not suppressible. She held up the screen so he could see the number. Unknown, New York area code. Sophie picked up. "Hello?" she said. And then her face did the thing it had done in the parking lot of Millbrook Elementary. The thing she always tried to control and couldn't quite, the brightness flooding in before the composure could catch it. "Yeah," Sophie said into the phone, her voice cracking slightly on the single syllable. "Yeah, we're here." She held the phone out to Ethan without another word. He took it. "Ethan," Victoria's voice. And in the background, behind her, the sound of a room that was not quiet in a normal way. Movement, voices raised, the particular human sound of 200 people reacting to something they had not expected. "Are you okay?" he said. "I ended it," she said. "The engagement, in front of everyone." He closed his eyes briefly. "Okay. Marcus is—" She laughed, and it was the real one, unguarded, the laugh from his kitchen. "He is not happy, I imagine. My lawyers are going to have an interesting Monday. Probably." "Ethan," her voice settled, "I need about 40 minutes to get out of this room without causing a full incident, and then I need to see Sophie. She's right here." "I know." A pause. "Tell her the decomposer thing is going to be on the test. I was right about that." He looked at Sophie, who was watching him with everything she had. "She says the decomposer thing is going to be on the test," he told Sophie. Sophie's face broke into the fullest smile he'd seen from her in weeks. She grabbed his arm with both hands and leaned her forehead against his shoulder and shook with something that was half laugh and half something else entirely. "Tell her I know," Sophie said, muffled against his jacket. "Tell her I studied." He told her. Victoria laughed again, and it echoed through the phone, and in the background the noise of the disrupted room continued, and Ethan Cross sat in a small anteroom in Manhattan with his daughter pressed against his arm and the phone at his ear, and he felt the particular stillness that came after something hard was done. Not relief, not triumph, just the clean quiet of a thing that had needed to happen finally happening. 40 minutes later, the door opened. Victoria came through it still in the green dress, the pearl earrings, her composure slightly rearranged from the event, but holding. She looked at Ethan first, a full look, nothing hidden in it, and then her eyes moved to Sophie. Sophie stood up from the chair. She walked across the small room, and Victoria met her halfway, and Sophie put her arms around her and held on with the particular intensity of a child who has been waiting and is done waiting. Victoria held her back. Both arms, no ceremony. Ethan watched them. He stood against the wall of the small back room, and he watched his daughter hold the woman he loved in the fluorescent light of a service corridor. And he thought about Claire saying unflinching. And he thought about Sophie's drawing with the 3 figures in crayon. And he thought about the tire swing in the backyard going still in the November cold. He crossed the room. He put his hand on Victoria's back gently, and she turned slightly into it without letting go of Sophie. And the 3 of them stood there in the small room in the imperfect, fluorescent, completely unglamorous truth of it. We should probably go, Sophie said finally, her voice slightly muffled. "The parking garage is expensive." Victoria pulled back enough to look at her. "How do you know that?" "I just assumed." Victoria looked at Ethan over Sophie's head. He looked back. "I know a place in the village," Victoria said. "Good pasta. Better than mine." "That's a high bar," Sophie said. "You're going to be surprised." They walked out of the Caldwell Hotel through the service corridor and then through the lobby and out into the December air of Midtown Manhattan. And the city was loud and cold and indifferent to all of it, and none of that mattered at all. The pasta in the village was, in fact, better than Victoria's. Sophie announced this with the solemnity of a judge delivering a verdict, approximately 7 minutes into the meal, and Victoria laughed so hard she put her fork down, and Ethan watched them across the small table in the small restaurant on a December Saturday night in New York City, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The particular uncomplicated warmth of a moment that was exactly what it appeared to be. No layer under it, no threat assessment running in the background. Just 3 people eating pasta under dim lights while the city moved outside the window. It was not perfect. Sophie knocked over a water glass. Victoria's phone rang 4 times during dinner. Lawyers, her assistant, a board member she did not pick up for. And the 4th time it rang, she turned it face down on the table with a decisiveness that seemed to settle something for her. Ethan's jacket had a small grease stain on the left cuff that he'd missed in the morning, which he noticed when he reached for the breadbasket and which seemed, in the context of where they were and who they were with, like exactly the right detail. They drove back to Millbrook that night. All 3 of them in Ethan's truck, Victoria in the passenger seat with her shoes off and her feet tucked under her, and her green dress replaced by a sweater she'd pulled from her bag. And Sophie in the back with her head against the window and her eyes drifting closed somewhere around the New Jersey border. The radio played low. The highway was quiet. Victoria looked out at the dark and didn't say much. And Ethan drove and didn't say much. And the silence between them was the same kind it had always been in the garage. Not empty, just full of things that didn't need words yet. At some point, she put her hand on the center console, not reaching for his hand exactly, just placing it there. And he moved his hand next to hers. And after a while, their fingers were loosely linked in the particular understated way of people who had been through enough together that they didn't need to make a production of contact. Sophie, from the back seat, did not say anything, but she was smiling in her sleep. The Monday after was the beginning of the rest of it, which is to say, complicated. Marcus Vane did not go quietly. Nobody who had spent 12 years constructing a position of power went quietly when that position collapsed in a hotel ballroom in front of 200 witnesses, and Marcus was not the kind of man who updated his self-image in response to evidence. His lawyers filed 2 motions in the first 48 hours. His communications team ran a story, planted, obvious to anyone paying attention, about Victoria's mental state and the instability of her decision-making. A board member who'd been sitting the fence moved to Vane's side, which meant his proxy numbers ticked back up slightly, even after the 2 institutional defections. Victoria handled it for Millbrook for 3 days before she had to go back to New York. She was at Ethan's kitchen table when she told him, "I need to be there in person," she said, "for the next few weeks at least. The lawyers can file everything remotely, but the board dynamics." "How long?" he said. She looked at her hands. "Honestly, I don't know. To get through the proxy challenge, close out Vane's motions, and stabilize the leadership situation, realistically, 2 months. Maybe 3. He nodded. "That's not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not disappearing. I'm telling you in advance what the timeline looks like. Which is different. I know it's different." She looked at him. "I know you know. I'm telling myself out loud." He almost smiled. "How's that going?" "It's a process." She picked up her coffee. "I want to be clear about something." "Okay." "I'm coming back," she said. "Not to visit. I mean, back. Here. Millbrook."
Yeah.
She said it like she was committing to something out loud because saying it made it real. "I've been thinking about the structure of the company. There's a management layer that's been ready for more authority for years. Priya runs half the operational side already without the title. If I transfer day-to-day oversight and keep the foundation and the strategic decisions, I can do most of that from anywhere." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this?" "For a while." "How long is a while?" She looked at her coffee. "Since about the 3rd day, I sat in your garage on a step stool." He was quiet. "I wasn't ready to say it then," she said, "because I wasn't sure if I was thinking clearly or just—" She made a gesture that meant wanting something and dressing it up as a plan. "But I've had 3 weeks in New York to think about it without the garage, and the conclusion is the same." "What's the conclusion?" She looked at him directly. "I don't want to run a company from Manhattan. I never did. I want to run the foundation, the education programs, the community investment work, the things my father actually cared about before Marcus turned it into a leverage instrument. I can do that from here, with better Wi-Fi and a real desk instead of your invoice table. The invoice table has character. The invoice table is held together with what I believe is a bungee cord. It's a quality bungee cord." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. I'm trying to tell you I want to move to Millbrook." "I know. You're very calm about that." "Sophie will be extremely not calm about it," he said. "She's going to reorganize the whole house." Victoria blinked. then laughed. The real one, the kitchen laugh. She's going to reorganize the house. She's been moving things around since you left. I think she's been preparing. Victoria pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were doing the bright, wet thing at the edges. I'm serious, Ethan said. She moved the step stool to the corner you used. She hasn't moved it back. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said, softly. Okay. 2 months was closer to 10 weeks in the end. 10 weeks of phone calls that were different from the earlier ones. Not shorter, not careful, not hedged. Long calls some nights. Victoria walking through her apartment while she talked. Ethan on the back porch in the January cold because reception was better there. Sophie on the phone with Victoria on Thursday nights, which had become their specific time, with a reliability that Sophie had established by simply starting it and continuing until it was a fact. They talked about school and decomposers and a new girl in Sophie's class named Danny who was aggressively competitive about reading scores, and Victoria gave very specific advice about academically competitive children that Sophie found useful and Ethan found illuminating about Victoria's own childhood. The board situation resolved in pieces. Vane's second motion was dismissed. The institutional shareholders who'd wavered came back into Victoria's camp after a regulatory finding went against one of Vane's subsidiaries, exactly what Ray Drummond's contact had predicted. The proxy challenge died without a formal vote because Vane no longer had the numbers, and he knew it, and the knowing of it made him dangerous in a different way for about 2 weeks, and then his lawyers told him his position was untenable, and he accepted a buyout of his board seat that cost Victoria's company money but cost Marcus something he valued more: the position. He left. Not graciously. He left the way he'd done everything, with his dignity arranged carefully over his retreat, a statement about pursuing other opportunities, a final quote to a financial journalist that was subtly hostile and completely transparent. But he left. Victoria called Ethan when it was final. It's done, she said. How do you feel? A pause. Tired, she said, and like I want a cup of coffee from Archer's. I'll tell Donna. She laughed, and it was the laugh with the particular quality that meant she was genuinely relieved, and Ethan sat on the back porch with the February cold around him and listened to it. Come home, he said. The word hung for a moment. Yeah, she said. I'm coming home. She arrived on a Thursday evening in late February with 2 suitcases and a large box that turned out to contain a coffee maker of a caliber that suggested she had opinions about coffee equipment that she'd been suppressing out of respect for his existing setup, which was adequate but not, apparently, optimal. Sophie met her at the door before the car had fully stopped, which was not typical Sophie behavior, and the hug was the kind that had duration to it, the kind that meant something was being let back in. You brought stuff, Sophie observed, looking at the suitcases. A little. Are you staying? Victoria looked at Ethan over Sophie's shoulder. Yeah, she said. I'm staying. Sophie absorbed this. She looked at the suitcases, at the box, at Victoria. You're going to need a drawer, Sophie said, with the practicality of someone who had been thinking about logistics. I reorganized the guest room, and I moved the step stool. I heard about the step stool. I kept it in the same corner you used. Victoria pulled Sophie in again briefly. Ethan took the suitcases. Nice coffee maker, he said, looking at the box. Yours was fine, Victoria said. That's not a compliment. It wasn't meant to be. Sophie took the box. They went inside. What? The next few months were not a montage. They were actual months, with actual friction, actual adjustment, actual negotiation over the small and large things that happen when a life gets rebuilt around more people than it was originally built for. Victoria's work was still real work. The foundation had 12 active programs, a staff of 19, and a funding cycle that required her focused attention regardless of whether she was doing it from Manhattan or a converted office in the back bedroom of a house on a residential block in Millbrook. She kept irregular hours. She took calls during dinner sometimes. She had a particular intensity when she was in the middle of a problem that Ethan had to learn to read. Not detachment, just concentration. And the difference mattered, and he learned it the same way he'd learned everything about her, by paying attention. She learned his things too, that he needed mornings to be quiet before noon, that the burned egg edges were, in fact, a feature and not a bug, and she was wrong about this and should let it go. That when he was working through something emotional, he built things, and the complexity of the thing corresponded roughly to the intensity of the feeling. And the week he finished a bookshelf with hand-cut dovetail joints for the living room was the week he was working through the anniversary of Claire's death. And she learned to recognize it and to be present without making it a conversation until he was ready. They were not always easy with each other. There was an argument in March about whether the house's schedule should accommodate her foundation calls or her calls should accommodate the house's schedule, which was really an argument about whose life was structurally prior, which was a legitimate question that they had not fully answered, and which surfaced with the sharpness of any real unresolved thing. She was used to being the axis. He was used to being the axis. They were two people who had each, in their own way, organized their whole world around a single center, and the work of becoming two axes of the same system required adjustment that was sometimes ungraceful. Sophie, for her part, navigated it with the pragmatism she brought to everything. She informed them, during the March argument, that she could hear everything from upstairs and also that she had a solution, which was a family rule that work calls before school drop-off were fine, but the dinner table was inviolable. She proposed it with the calm authority of a small labor arbitrator. They both agreed, partly because it was a good solution, and partly because being arbitrated by a 9-year-old was sufficiently humbling to break the tension. The dinner table became inviolable. It was a small rule, and it mattered enormously. In April, Victoria formally transferred operational oversight of Hale Industries' corporate divisions to a restructured executive committee, with Priya promoted, finally, with a title that matched what she'd been doing for 3 years, as Chief of Operations. Victoria retained the board chair position and the charitable foundation, which she renamed the Hale Community Foundation, without the corporate branding, which was a small change that meant something to her that she explained to Ethan one evening and did not explain publicly. "My father named it after himself," she said. "He wasn't a vain man. He just thought it meant permanence. He thought if his name was on it, it would last." "The foundation is still there," Ethan said. "Yeah." She looked at the papers on her desk, the converted back bedroom, now a real office, with a real desk, and the quality coffee maker, and one of Sophie's drawings pinned above the monitor because Sophie had given it to her without comment, and she'd put it up without comment, and neither of them discussed it. "I just want it to be about the work, not the name." He nodded. "Your father would have been okay with that?" She thought about it. "He would have argued with me for a week," she said, "and then he would have said I was right and acted like it was his idea." "Sounds familiar," Ethan said. She threw a pen at him. The spring in Millbrook was the kind of spring that made the argument for small towns without saying a word about it. The oak tree in the yard came back in stages, first the green, then the full canopy, then the light coming through it in the shifting way that made the backyard feel like a different country than the house. Sophie, now 9, and operating with an authority commensurate with the upgrade, talked Ethan into actually using the tire swing, which she then determined was too babyish for her, but which Victoria used one afternoon sitting sideways on it with her feet on the ground while she read a foundation proposal on her tablet, which Sophie photographed without asking, and which became one of those pictures that nobody planned. Donna, at Archer's, made no comment when Victoria started appearing as a regular rather than a visitor. She simply added a cup to Ethan's counter on the mornings Victoria came in, the same way Sophie had added a cup to the table at home, and the two habits rhymed with each other in a way that Ethan noticed and stored without saying anything, because some things were better held than spoken. Ray Drummond came to visit in May, drove up from Dallas with his wife, a woman named Carol, who had opinions about everything and got along immediately with Sophie on the strength of shared opinions about competitive reading programs, and sat with Ethan in the backyard while Victoria and Carol and Sophie occupied the kitchen in a way that generated considerable noise. "You doing all right?" Ray said. He was eating licorice. He was always eating licorice. "Yeah," Ethan said. "That's a yes." "It's a yes." Ray looked at the yard, the tire swing, the oak tree, the light coming through it. "This is different from what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something more complicated." "You've always made everything more complicated than it needed to be." Ethan looked at him. I'm not doing that anymore. I can see that. Ray chewed his licorice. Looks good on you. From inside, Sophie's voice rose above the general kitchen noise with something about the correct technique for brownie batter. And Carol's voice responded with what sounded like a counter-argument, and Victoria's laugh cut through both of them. Ethan and Ray sat in the backyard in the May afternoon and said nothing else for a while, which was the specific kind of not talking that meant everything was fine. Well, they married in June. Not because June was planned or symbolic or any particular kind of meaningful. It was June, because that was when everything else had settled enough that the question of timing stopped feeling like a question. Victoria brought it up first, which surprised Ethan slightly, and he said yes before she finished the sentence, which surprised her slightly. And Sophie, who had been listening from the hallway in the way she listened to things she wanted to know about but hadn't been invited into yet, appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, "Finally," with the specific exasperation of someone who had been waiting for the adults to arrive at an obvious conclusion. They married in the backyard. Not because they couldn't afford anything else. This was a woman who had stood in a hotel ballroom in Manhattan in a dark green dress in front of 200 investors, but because the backyard was where it made sense. Under the oak tree, in the particular light that came through the leaves in the late afternoon, with the tire swing visible behind them and the back porch where they'd sat on difficult evenings, and the kitchen window through which the yellow light still fell over the table. Donna came. Ray and Carol came. Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Keller, came, because she'd been invited by Sophie directly with a handwritten note, and apparently Mrs. Keller's look, the specific look Sophie had described at the beginning of all this, was actually an expression of fondness that Sophie had misread. Priya flew in from New York, 12 people total, neighbors who had become the specific kind of neighbors that small towns produce. Not intrusive, just present, the kind who appeared when it mattered. Victoria wore a dress that was not dark green and not formal. Ivory, simple, something she'd described as practical but not boring. And she carried a small bunch of flowers Sophie had picked from the yard and assembled with the focused attention she brought to science projects. The arrangement was imperfect and slightly lopsided and exactly right. Ethan wore the navy jacket. He'd checked it twice for grease stains. There were none. Sophie stood between them. Not as a flower girl, not in any assigned role. She told them she didn't want a role. She just wanted to stand there, and they'd said that was fine. And so she stood there in the blue dress she'd worn to the school presentation in the fall, her hair fully braided, holding the rings in her hand with the seriousness of someone trusted with an important thing. There was no officiant speech about perfect love or flawless commitment, because neither Ethan nor Victoria had wanted that. The woman who married them, a judge named Harriet, who was Donna's cousin, and had, apparently, been told the full story and shown up with an expression of someone who intended to do the thing properly, kept it short and direct, the way real things often were. Ethan said what he'd decided to say, which was not written down because he didn't trust himself to read something off a paper without it feeling like a report. I spent 4 years thinking the hardest thing I'd ever do was keep going after I lost Claire. Turns out the hardest thing was learning that keeping going meant letting someone in again. I'm glad I did. I'm glad it was you. I love you, and I'm not flinching. Victoria looked at him while he said it, and her jaw did the small tightening thing, and she didn't look away. She said, "I walked into a cafe in Millbrook 9 months ago running for my own life. I found a mechanic who didn't ask questions, and a little girl who told me I was overcooking the garlic, and somewhere in between I found out what I'd been running toward without knowing it. I love you both. I'm not leaving." Sophie, between them, produced the rings from her palm with the ceremony of someone delivering something carefully kept. Harriet said the words. They were married. Sophie said, "Okay, now can we eat?" Which broke the moment in exactly the right way, and Donna laughed out loud, and Ray ate his licorice, and the afternoon went on in the backyard under the oak tree. Well, here is what the year after looked like, assembled in its ordinary and important parts. Sophie Cross. Now Sophie Cross still, because she'd been asked and she'd thought about it for 2 days and come back with, "I want to keep it. It's mine and Dad's and Mom's, but I'd like Victoria's name too, like a middle name, which I know that's weird, but it's what I want." And it was not weird at all. Sophie won her school's regional science competition with a project about water filtration that had evolved considerably since its first version. She was 9 going on 45, and she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, how to let herself be 9 sometimes, which was its own kind of growth. Ethan kept the shop. This was never in question. He'd had one conversation with Victoria about it. She'd asked once, carefully, whether he wanted to do something different, whether the shop was what he wanted or what he'd settled for, and he'd said, "I like building things. I like fixing things. I like knowing at the end of a day exactly what I did and whether it worked." And then he'd gone back to whatever he was working on, and she'd let it rest, because she understood it the same way she understood the dovetail joints and the bookshelf and the week of the anniversary. The shop was not a compromise. It was him. Victoria ran the foundation from the back bedroom 3 days a week, and from New York 1 day a week, and from wherever she happened to be the 5th day, which varied. The foundation's education programs expanded in the second year. 2 new partnerships with rural school districts, a reading program that Sophie immediately took a territorial interest in, a small grant program for community projects that generated 40 applications in its first round, and which Victoria read personally, all 40, over the course of a weekend that she called exhausting and genuinely the best thing I've done with the family money. The corporate side of Hale Industries ran without her hand on it daily, and Priya called on Thursdays with a summary, and the summary was almost always fine, and fine was, it turned out, entirely sufficient. Marcus Vane resurfaced once, 6 months after the ballroom, in a profile piece in a business magazine that spent considerable space suggesting he'd been unfairly displaced in a corporate coup orchestrated by an emotionally unstable heiress. Victoria read the piece, set it down, and went to help Sophie with a math problem. She did not respond to it publicly. She did not need to. The Foundation's annual report, released the same month, documented 4,700 students served, 11 community programs funded, and a 23% increase in outcomes across partner schools. The numbers said everything that needed saying. Ethan read the Marcus piece once, in the shop, and then used it to prop up the leg of the invoice table that the bungee cord was no longer adequately supporting. He found this genuinely satisfying. Bullshit. What Ethan Cross had learned by the end of it was something he couldn't have told you at the beginning and couldn't have learned any other way. That fear and love were not opposites. They were neighbors, but sometimes they were roommates. The same thing that made you love something was the thing that made you terrified of losing it, and you could not have one without the other. And the people who told you fear was the enemy of love had it wrong. Fear was just love with nowhere to go. The work, the actual work, the hard kind, was not eliminating fear. It was deciding to move anyway. Not bravely, not dramatically, not with a speech, just deciding that the thing on the other side was worth the movement. He'd learned this from Sophie, not from himself. He'd needed a 9-year-old to tell him what he already knew but had stopped believing. He thought about this sometimes in the shop, under a car, or over an engine, with the radio going and the September light coming in at the angle it always did. He thought about the morning in Archer's café that started all of it. The frightened woman, the man with his hand around her wrist, the moment he decided to stand up while everyone else looked away. And how that morning had looked from the outside like a simple thing. A man helping a stranger. A small act of ordinary decency. Nobody watching would have known that the man doing it was held together with routine and forward momentum, that he hadn't let anyone close in 4 years, that he was more afraid of love than he had ever been of any room he'd cleared or any operation he'd run. They wouldn't have known. He was glad sometimes that they didn't. Some things were better carried quietly until they resolved into something else. Victoria found him on a Tuesday evening in September, a year and change after the morning in the café, the circle of it not lost on either of them, sitting on the back porch with his coffee, looking at the yard. The oak tree was changing color. The tire swing was turning slightly in the early evening air. Sophie was upstairs doing homework with the radio on, which Ethan had been specifically not commenting on, picking his battles. Victoria sat beside him. She had her coffee and the slight preoccupation of someone who had just finished a long call and was arriving back into the actual present. She sat, and she looked at the yard, and after a while she said, "Good day?" "Yeah," he said. "You?" "Long, productive. A grant application from a school in rural Kentucky that I can't stop thinking about." "Is that good?" "Yeah, the good kind of can't stop thinking about it." They sat. The oak tree moved in the small wind. "Sophie asked me today," Victoria said, "whether her mom would have liked me." Ethan looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know. I said I hoped so. I said her mom loved people who were real with her, and I was trying to be." She paused. "And then Sophie said she would have. She had good taste," and went back to her homework. Ethan looked at the tree. "That sounds right," he said. "Yeah." Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder. "It did." They sat like that while the evening came in, and the yard went to gold and then to the blue-gray of early dark. And inside the house, Sophie's radio played something indistinct and warm, and the kitchen light came on automatically at 7 like it always did. That same slightly too yellow light that still needed a new bulb, that neither of them had replaced because somehow it had become part of the specific texture of home. The former Navy SEAL and the woman who had walked into a cafe in Millbrook, running from her own life, sat on the back porch of the house they shared and watched the evening and did not say anything else for a long time. And that was enough. That was more than enough. It was, in the end, the whole thing.